Hello everybody, this is a video I'm expecting you to use when you're retaking your CER test. Now first of all, on top, make sure you used a rubric to help you out. At the very least, go through the proficients. And so when you write your claim, go back up here, read it over. Okay, yes, I have it. When you write your evidence, go back up to the proficients, read through these. Yep, I've got it. And same thing for the reasoning. And a really good example is this one in the reasoning that says, excuse me, says include scientific principles. So if you just read through this after you write your reasoning, you might say, oh, I don't have a scientific principle. I got to make sure I add one. So again, use the rubric here, or you can use the posters in our room to help you write your CER. There's really no good excuse to be missing any important parts of a CER because you have this resource here. Now, one of the big mistakes I saw that people made when they were writing their tests is they answered the wrong question. Probably about a third of you wrote about which ones will float, which I'm not sure why. That was the practice one we did, but here, let's read it. It's bolded. Which materials would sink if placed in fresh water? And it was underlined and it was made a different color. So we have to make sure we read carefully. We can't skip over stuff. We can't just assume it's the same one. Now, your practice one was very, very, very similar. But now instead of floating, you have to answer which materials would sink if placed in fresh water. And these are the materials you can choose from. So you got lead, steel, aluminum, concrete, brick, ice, oak, and cork. And these are their densities. Make sure you're reading the graph correctly. And it says placed in fresh water, here's the density of water. And we have to say fresh water because it's not salt water. Salt water would have a different densities. And depending on how much salt there is, the density would change. So go ahead, pause this video, and write your claim. All right, so now you're done writing your claim. Now, first of all, let me back up a little bit. If you had trouble writing this, I would go through the scientific principles. One of these scientific principles is the best choice. And it's going to be one of these four. Read through them. And a couple of them are obvious. Nope, get rid of them. They have nothing to do with which materials would sink if placed in fresh water. Two of them would be okay, but there's one that's really, really important. And that one actually helps you identify which materials would sink. So you want to get in a good habit of reading through the scientific principles. Now, you wrote your claim. Let's talk about your evidence. Whatever you mentioned in your claim, you have to back it up with evidence. So whatever materials you mention, again, I'm not going to tell you which ones to put. That's for you. But make sure you have both qualitative and quantitative information. In other words, don't just list the ones that you did in the claim. You already listed them. But what's the quantitative data? And that's the density. So whichever ones you list, make sure you include the densities and don't forget the labels. A lot of people put 7.8, 2.4, 0.9, 0.6, whatever, but they never put the grams/centimeters cubed. So make sure you label that as well. It'll give you a higher score. So here, with your evidence, you can write it as a paragraph, or you can bullet it, whatever you want to do, and write it as a list. But make sure whatever you have in claim, you back it up with evidence. Now, don't put the scientific principle here. You don't have to go into deep explanations. Just what is the evidence? Now, the reasoning would be the longer part. Now, there's four parts that I'm really looking for in the reasoning, but I'll stop for a second. If you haven't paused to write the evidence, make sure you do that. Okay, now that you're done with the claim and evidence, and you'll understand why it's important to have those done first. First of all, reasoning. The first thing I want you to do is restate your claim. What I would do is I would just go up here, copy and paste your claim, and put it down here. So once you have your claim, you got to figure out in reasoning what scientific principle supports it. Or in some cases, you'll have multiple scientific principles. Now here again, I would copy and paste and put them down here. So work smarter, not harder. You can use if you're doing a test on a computer, copy and paste. So you have your claim, and then what scientific principle, and you want to pick the scientific principle that would connect the evidence to your claim. So whatever it is, you're going to write down, and I would include things like scientific principle number 1 says, or scientific principle number 2 says, whatever number you use, but I would specifically say, this is the scientific, piece, that scientific principle piece that supports my number. You might want to, and you can even shorten and say SP number 3, SP number 4, whatever it is. And word it catchy, like according to scientific principle number 4, and then go ahead and paste it in there. Now, here's the part that a lot of people miss. You have to, once you include a scientific principle, you have to go back and explain why is that scientific principle important. Don't just list the claim and then the scientific principle and be done. You have to explain why that scientific principle is important. And that's really only one sentence. And then close your reasoning with a conclusionary statement. You know, a lot of times I like to say, therefore, and then it's kind of restating the claim, but therefore these objects will float. Therefore, these objects will sink in this case. So you want to put it all together. So when I read it, it flows and makes sense. And reread this multiple times to make sure the wording is good and everything flows. So again, there's 4 parts you need to have in a reasoning. Your claim, restate your claim. Talk about the scientific principle. Explain why the scientific principle connects the evidence back to the claim. And then you have to have a conclusionary statement. Try and find also a spot to put some of that evidence back in there, those data points that you need. So hopefully this will help you finish up and do a really strong CER test so that you earn proficient scores. Thanks.